Title: The Echoes of the Mind. Chapter 1. The Experiment Begins. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently overhead, casting an unsettling glow in the sterile waiting room of the research facility. Michael sat alone, his heart racing as he thumbed through the stack of paperwork in his lap, his fingers trembling slightly. The scent of antiseptic permeated the air, mingling with the metallic tang of fear that hung like a fog in the cramped space. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each tick echoing like a heartbeat, steady, relentless, and unyielding. He glanced around at the other participants waiting for the trial to begin. Each face reflected a blend of anticipation and trepidation, eyes darting nervously, as if they, too, could sense the shadows lurking just beyond the sterile white walls. The facility felt suffocating, a labyrinth of clean lines and clinical precision that somehow bred a sense of dread. "Michael!" a voice called from the doorway, breaking through the thick silence like a gunshot. A nurse stood there, clipboard in hand, her expression a blend of professionalism and something unnameable. Was it pity? Curiosity? Michael couldn't quite place it. He rose from his seat, the chair scraping against the floor with a grating sound that made him flinch. As he followed the nurse down the narrow corridor, the overhead lights flickered again, creating an erratic dance of light and shadow that made the walls seem to pulsate. The sensation of being watched prickled at the back of his neck, a heavy weight that followed him like a shadow. The nurse led him into a small examination room, the air inside thick with tension. A doctor stood behind a counter cluttered with medical instruments, his back turned as he shuffled through papers. Michael could see the faint reflection of his anxious face in a glass panel, an echo of the man he used to be, a man now consumed by desperation and uncertainty. "Please take a seat," the doctor said, finally turning to face Michael. His voice was smooth, almost hypnotic, but there was a glint in his eye that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. The doctor gestured toward a cold metal chair, and Michael sat, feeling exposed under the bright lights. "Welcome to the Cognitive Enhancement Trial," the doctor said, his tone clinical and detached. "You've made a brave choice in participating, and I assure you, we're on the cutting edge of science." Michael nodded, swallowing hard. He had heard the promises of this drug, the potential to unlock hidden abilities, to elevate his mind beyond its current limitations. But the nagging feeling of unease lingered in the back of his mind like a whisper, a warning he couldn't ignore. "We're about to begin," the doctor continued, his voice steady and calm. "But first, I need to go over the potential risks involved." He leaned closer, eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke. "This drug can enhance your cognitive functions dramatically, but it may also lead to unforeseen consequences. Some participants have reported, well, let's say, altered perceptions of reality." Michael's heart raced. Altered perceptions? The words hung in the air like a noose, tightening around his throat. "You may experience hallucinations, feelings of paranoia, or even disconnect from your physical body," the doctor added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But don't worry, you will be monitored closely, and we'll provide support as needed." The nurse nodded, her expression unchanging, as if she were a statue carved from stone. Michael felt a surge of dread wash over him. He had come here to escape his mundane existence, to become someone more, but now he questioned whether he was walking into a trap. As the doctor prepared the injection, the room felt charged with energy, the air thickening with anticipation. Michael's pulse quickened, each heartbeat a drum roll leading up to the moment of truth. The doctor turned back, syringe in hand, and for a brief moment, time slowed. The world around him blurred, and he could hear the whispers again, soft, insistent, weaving through his thoughts. "Join us. Help us." He shook his head, trying to dispel the encroaching darkness. It was just the fear talking, he told himself, just the anxiety bubbling to the surface. He could do this. He had to do this. "Are you ready?" the doctor asked, his voice a calm oasis amid the storm brewing in Michael's mind. Taking a deep breath, Michael nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. The needle pierced his skin, sending a jolt through his arm, and he felt warmth spread through him, a rush that ignited every nerve ending. For a moment, he felt invincible, as if he could conquer the world. But that warmth quickly turned to cold, creeping through his veins like an unwelcome fog. Just relax, the doctor instructed, his tone soothing yet unsettling. Let the drug take effect. It will transform you. Michael closed his eyes, trying to center himself, but the world began to shift. When he opened his eyes again, the room was darker, shadows creeping in from the corners. The once sterile walls seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting, as if breathing. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him, and a sense of disconnection gripped him. It was as if he was floating above himself, watching the scene unfold from a distance. The doctor's voice became muffled, the words swirling around him, losing all meaning. "Michael!" The nurse's voice cut through the fog, but it felt like a distant echo. "Are you with us?" He tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat, choked by an invisible force. The shadows in the room deepened, dark figures lurking just beyond the reach of the light, their forms twisting and writhing. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. "Help us! Join us!" Fear clawed at his chest as he felt himself being pulled toward the darkness, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurring into a swirling abyss. He fought against it, but the shadows wrapped around him like a shroud, dragging him deeper into their cold embrace. In that moment, Michael realized the truth. He had stepped into a realm far beyond his understanding, where shadows danced on the edges of sanity and the mind became a prison. As the darkness consumed him, he understood that the experiment was just beginning, and he was but a pawn in a game much larger than himself. The echoes of the past reverberated through his mind as he succumbed to the encroaching terror, leaving behind the light of reality, plunging into the depths of his own consciousness, where the shadows awaited him with open arms. Chapter 2: A Deteriorating Reality. As the days blurred into one another, Michael's initial euphoria from the drug trial faded, giving way to a creeping sense of dread. The world outside his window appeared vibrant, full of life, yet he felt more disconnected from it than ever. He could hear laughter in the distance, children playing in the park, and the rustle of leaves in the wind, but it all felt like a distant echo, reverberating in a realm he could no longer access. Each morning began with a hollow ache in his chest, the remnants of the previous day's clarity now clouded by an overwhelming fog of confusion and fear. He would sit on the edge of his bed, staring at his reflection in the mirror, searching for the spark that once ignited his ambition. But the face looking back at him was a stranger, eyes wide with anxiety, skin pale and drawn. The darkness he had so desperately tried to escape was creeping back, clawing at the edges of his mind, and he was terrified it would swallow him whole. The drug had initially opened a door to his mind, a portal to possibilities he had never dared to imagine. Numbers and equations flowed effortlessly through his thoughts. Words poured from his mouth like water from a broken dam, but now that door felt like a trap, the threshold between genius and madness collapsing into a singularity of despair. At work, the mundane tasks that had once felt like shackles now seemed insurmountable. He sat at his desk, the flickering fluorescent lights above him casting a harsh glow on the sterile environment, and tried to focus on the reports piling up around him. Yet, each attempt was met with a disorienting wave of dizziness, as if the very act of concentrating was tearing at the fabric of his reality. He could hear the whispers again, soft and insistent, weaving through his thoughts like smoke. "Help us! Help us!" The phrase twisted in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. He gripped the edges of his desk, trying to anchor himself, but the shadows in the corners of the office seemed to stretch toward him, curling around the other employees like dark tendrils. He caught the gaze of a co-worker, Emma, whose brow furrowed in concern as she watched him. The pity in her eyes stung, igniting a sense of paranoia that bubbled to the surface. "What's wrong with you, Michael?" she asked, her voice low and cautious, as if afraid to awaken the darkness lurking inside him. He forced a smile, a mask to hide the turmoil roiling beneath. "Just tired," he lied, but even he could hear the tremor in his voice. As the days turned into nights, the walls of his apartment began to close in on him. The once comforting confines of his home morphed into a suffocating prison. Shadows lurked in every corner, and the silence was deafening, punctuated only by the erratic thumping of his heart. Each creak of the floorboards echoed through the stillness, sending waves of anxiety surging through him. At night, the hallucinations grew more vivid. As he lay in bed, drifting in and out of restless sleep, he would catch glimpses of dark figures lurking just beyond his field of vision. Their forms flickered at the edges of his sight, disappearing as soon as he turned to look. He began to dread the hours of darkness, the silence that wrapped around him like a shroud. The walls seemed to close in tighter, whispering secrets he could not comprehend. The whispers became louder, insistent. "Join us." One evening, while sitting alone in his dimly lit apartment, he suddenly felt the oppressive weight of the shadows closing in around him. The air grew thick, almost electric, as he struggled to breathe. It was as if the very essence of the darkness was alive, reaching out to him with ghostly fingers. Panic surged within him, and he leaped to his feet, desperate to escape the confines of his mind. "Enough!" he shouted into the empty room, his voice reverberating off the walls like a desperate plea. But the darkness only responded with silence, a thick, heavy quiet that suffocated him. Determined to escape, Michael grabbed his jacket and stumbled out of the apartment. He needed fresh air, a break from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over him like a storm cloud. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt the familiar tingle of paranoia wash over him. The shadows seemed to whisper his name, wrapping around him like a vice. Outside, the world was vibrant, yet Michael felt detached from it all. The bustling streets were filled with laughter and chatter, but to him, it felt like a distant echo, like a memory he could no longer access. He walked aimlessly, the crowd swirling around him like a chaotic tide, and the noise became a cacophony that grated against his senses. But as he moved through the throng, he caught glimpses of shadowy figures lurking just outside his peripheral vision. Each time he turned to look, they vanished, leaving only the lingering sensation of being watched. His heart raced, panic gripping him as he navigated the streets, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Help us!" He pressed his hands to his temples, desperately trying to block out the voices that clamored for his attention. The world around him blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds, and he felt as though he were teetering on the edge of a precipice. In a moment of desperation, he ducked into a nearby alley, the shadows pooling around him like a thick fog. The air was damp and stale, and he pressed his back against the cool brick wall, trying to steady his racing heart. But the darkness seemed to seep into his skin, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. As he stood there, panting, he caught a glimpse of something in the darkness, a fleeting shadow that slithered just out of sight. Fear washed over him, and he felt the urge to run, to escape the suffocating presence that seemed to close in around him. "Get away from me!" he shouted into the void, but the only response was silence. The whispers returned, echoing through his mind, a mournful chorus that threatened to drown him. Just when he thought he might drown in despair, he heard a soft voice break through the fog. "Michael!" He turned to see Emma standing at the entrance of the alley, concern etched across her face. "Are you okay?" The sight of her felt like a lifeline thrown into the turbulent sea of his mind. He opened his mouth to respond, but words failed him. The shadows lingered behind him, whispering, tugging at his sanity, but the warmth of her presence anchored him momentarily. I don't know," he finally managed, his voice barely a whisper. Emma stepped closer, and he could see the worry in her eyes. "You've been acting strange. I was worried about you. Let's get out of here. You don't have to do this alone." For a moment, the shadows receded, and the whispers grew quieter, as if they were hesitant to intrude on the fragile connection between them. He hesitated, caught between the pull of the darkness and the flicker of hope that Emma offered. But the shadows were relentless, clawing at his mind, whispering doubts and fears. "Help us! Help us!" With a deep breath, Michael made a choice. He could either succumb to the darkness or reach out to the light, however faint it might be. He took a step forward, allowing Emma to guide him out of the alley, back into the bustling world of noise and chaos. The shadows loomed behind him, still whispering their haunting refrain, but he felt a flicker of strength ignite within him. He wasn't alone in this struggle. As they emerged into the street, Michael realized that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but perhaps, just perhaps, He could find a way to confront the darkness that threatened to consume him. The battle was far from over, but he was willing to fight, to face the shadows head-on, in search of the light he so desperately sought. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Mind. The shadows grew longer with each passing day, stretching their tendrils into every corner of Michael's mind. The initial euphoria of the drug had faded, leaving behind a suffocating fog that clouded his thoughts and left him gasping for clarity. With each sunrise, he felt the warmth of hope drain away, replaced by a bone-chilling realization. He was not merely battling external fears, but waging war against the demons lurking within himself. It began subtly, an undercurrent of unease that crawled beneath his skin. At first, he dismissed it as the side effects of the trial, something to be expected, but soon, those whispers turned into haunting echoes, words that slithered through his consciousness like serpents, twisting his perception of reality. "Help us," they begged, their tones chillingly familiar, as if they were echoes of his own thoughts turned against him. In the confines of his apartment, the world outside became a distant memory, muffled by the walls that seemed to pulse with life. Alone at night, the darkness felt thick and suffocating, wrapping around him like a shroud. He would sit in his living room, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the street lamp outside, and the silhouettes began to morph into grotesque forms, distorted faces that twisted in anguish. One night he awoke from a restless sleep, drenched in sweat, his heart racing as if he had just run a marathon. The shadows in his room danced mockingly, shifting and swirling as if alive. Michael rubbed his eyes, desperate to shake off the remnants of sleep, but the images only grew sharper, more vivid. He could swear he heard voices, soft and insistent, weaving through the darkness like a web. "Michael!" a voice called, smooth and seductive, laced with an otherworldly quality. He turned to see a figure standing at the foot of his bed, cloaked in darkness, its features obscured. Panic surged within him as he fumbled for the light switch, but the room remained shrouded in gloom, the darkness clinging to the corners like a malevolent entity. "Who are you?" he croaked, his voice trembling. The figure stepped closer, and though he couldn't see its face, he felt the weight of its gaze pressing down on him, penetrating the depths of his fear. "I am you, Michael," it whispered, the voice wrapping around him like a serpent. "I am everything you've hidden, everything you've tried to forget." With that proclamation, a torrent of memories surged through his mind, images of laughter and light, joy and connection, followed by shadows of guilt, pain, and loss. He felt himself spiraling, drowning in the emotional flood that threatened to consume him. "Stop!" he shouted, clenching his fists against the sheets, willing the figure to disappear, but it remained, an ominous presence that filled the room with despair. "You cannot run from me," it taunted, the voice echoing with an unsettling familiarity. "I am the shadow that follows you, the darkness that lurks in your heart. You can't escape." In a fit of terror, Michael scrambled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold floor as he backed away from the entity. His heart raced as he darted for the door, but the figure blocked his path, an impenetrable wall of shadow. The whispers intensified, rising into a deafening crescendo, filling his mind with a cacophony of anguish and regret. Suddenly, he was thrown into a whirlwind of images, a kaleidoscope of moments from his past that played out before him like a film reel gone awry. He saw himself as a child, full of laughter, running through sun-drenched fields, only to be abruptly yanked back to the present, the joy replaced by the haunting memory of his brother's accident, a moment that had shattered their family and left him drowning in guilt. The weight of the memories pressed down on him, and he stumbled backward, desperate to escape the onslaught of pain. "Get away from me!" he screamed, tears streaming down his cheeks as he fought against the darkness that threatened to envelop him. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, he lunged for the door, flinging it open and stumbling into the hallway. The cold air hit him like a slap, grounding him in reality, but the shadows followed, slinking along the walls like predators stalking their prey. He sprinted down the dimly lit corridor of his apartment building, breathless and panicked, the whispers echoing in his ears, drowning out the sound of his racing heart. Each footfall seemed to draw the darkness closer, an inescapable presence that taunted him with every step. "Michael!" The voice was familiar, grounding him momentarily. Emma appeared at the end of the hallway, concern etched across her features as she rushed toward him. "What's wrong? You look— Get away!" he shouted, the fear spilling out as he tried to push past her. "It's following me. I can't escape. Michael, stop!" she pleaded, grabbing his arm to steady him. Her touch grounded him, but the shadows continued to swirl around them, creeping closer as if drawn by his fear. "Please, you need to listen to me," she urged, her voice steady, cutting through the chaos. "You're not alone in this. I'm here to help you." As she spoke, the weight of the shadows began to lift slightly, the whispers retreating momentarily. Michael took a shaky breath, fighting against the instinct to flee. "Help me," he whispered, the vulnerability raw in his voice. "I don't know what's real anymore." Emma nodded, determination flaring in her eyes. "We'll figure this out together. You're not losing your mind, you're experiencing something that can be explained." With her by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope pierce through the darkness. The shadows still loomed, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a way to confront them, together. "Let's get out of here," she said, and with a tentative grip on his hand, she led him back down the hallway, into the world beyond the confines of his mind. But as they stepped into the light of the lobby, Michael could still feel the shadows creeping at the edges of his vision, whispers of doubt slithering through his thoughts. He knew the darkness would not be easily vanquished. It had become a part of him, a constant echo in the back of his mind. And yet, as he looked into Emma's eyes, he found a flicker of strength, a promise that he wouldn't have to face the shadows alone. The battle ahead would be fierce, but perhaps, with someone by his side, he could find a way to push back against the encroaching darkness, to reclaim the light that had once illuminated his path. But the road to freedom would be fraught with peril, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were merely biding their time, waiting for the moment when his resolve would falter. The nightmare was far from over, and as he stepped into the unknown, he braced himself for the fight of his life against the darkness that sought to consume him. Chapter 4. Descent into Paranoia. Days morphed into a disorienting blur, a hazy limbo where reality twisted at the seams. The initial clarity that Michael had felt after the drug trial had turned into a murky fog, dense and suffocating. Each morning, he would awaken in a cold sweat, heart racing, the remnants of nightmares clinging to him like cobwebs. The shadows in his apartment felt heavier, their presence more pronounced, whispering secrets that rattled against the walls of his mind. At work, Michael became a ghost. He walked the sterile halls of the office like a marionette, strings pulled taut by invisible forces. Conversations around him flowed seamlessly, laughter erupted like fireworks. But he stood at the edge, detached, an observer to a life that felt increasingly foreign. His co-workers glanced at him with a mixture of concern and confusion, and their looks only intensified the growing paranoia gnawing at his insides. "Michael, are you all right?" Emma's voice broke through his daze one afternoon as he stared blankly at his computer screen, the cursor blinking mockingly in the silence. The question felt loaded, a weighty probe into his unraveling psyche. "Yeah, just tired," he managed to reply, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But inside, the whispers surged louder, filling the air with taunting echoes of his insecurities. "You're losing it. They can see it." As the days dragged on, the whispers evolved into a dissonant chorus, drowning out any semblance of rational thought. Michael found himself hearing fragments of conversations that weren't happening. His co-workers murmuring behind closed doors, fingers pointing, hushed voices that snaked around him like smoke. "Did you hear what happened to him? He's not right in the head." He felt as though he were becoming a character in a twisted play, the world around him an elaborate stage set for a performance he couldn't control. Every laugh echoed with malice. Every glance felt like a judgment. The walls of the office seemed to close in, the fluorescent lights above buzzing ominously, casting flickering shadows that twisted into grotesque shapes. During one particularly agonizing meeting, the reality of his paranoia crashed down on him. As the team discussed quarterly projections, Michael sat in a haze, his thoughts spiraling. He glanced around the room, watching the expressions on his colleagues' faces morph into distorted masks of disdain. The conference table stretched infinitely, and the voices faded into a haunting murmur that tickled at the edges of his consciousness. You don't belong here. You're a failure. The thought gripped him, a vice tightening around his throat. He blinked hard, willing the images to clear, but they only deepened. When he looked up again, the room was vacant, an empty shell filled with echoing whispers that twisted through the air. His heart raced as he realized he was alone, except for the shadows that lurked just beyond the light, creeping closer with every tick of the clock. Michael? Emma's voice cut through the fog, and he turned to find her staring at him, concern etched across her features. Are you okay? You seemed distant. I'm fine, he snapped, but the edge in his voice surprised him. A flicker of guilt flashed across her face, and he felt the crushing weight of his outburst. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Just take care of yourself, she said softly, the kindness in her voice piercing through the murk of his paranoia. But even her warmth felt tainted, laced with a hint of pity that made his skin crawl. As Michael left the meeting, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, their whispers clawing at his mind. He quickened his pace down the hall, desperation flooding his senses. The shadows seemed to cling to him, a cold embrace that whispered his deepest fears. That night, he returned home and collapsed into bed, exhaustion weighing down his limbs. But sleep eluded him, and the shadows crept into the corners of his mind, taunting him with their silent presence. The whispers were a constant undercurrent, swirling around him like a tempest. In the dim light of his room, he felt a chill run down his spine as he caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. He squinted, straining to see, but there was nothing, just darkness, thick and oppressive. His heart pounded in his chest, and he rolled over, pulling the covers tighter around himself, as if they could shield him from the encroaching nightmare. The days turned into weeks, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They morphed into figures, dark silhouettes that flitted just out of sight. He could feel them watching, waiting, lurking in the shadows. The isolation consumed him, the walls of his apartment closing in, suffocating him with their oppressive weight. One night, as he sat in the silence, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. Help us. You must help us. The voice was deep, resonating through the very fabric of his being, vibrating with an urgency that made his skin prickle. Michael's heart raced as he stumbled to his feet, the shadows swirling around him like a storm. The room felt alive, the walls breathing, pulsating with an energy that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He could see shapes forming in the darkness, grotesque figures that writhed and twisted, their mouths opening in silent screams. No! He shouted, the word bursting from his lips in a frantic plea. He stumbled backward, scrambling toward the door, but it felt like the shadows were closing in, pulling him back into their depths. Michael! Emma's voice pierced through the chaos, breaking the spell that held him captive. He turned to see her standing at the entrance of his apartment, concern etched across her face. What's happening? It's here. The shadows. They won't leave me alone. His voice cracked, and the fear in his eyes mirrored the panic he felt inside. Emma stepped forward, her expression shifting from fear to determination. You need to fight it, Michael. You're stronger than this. Her words resonated in his mind like a lifeline thrown into a turbulent sea. In that moment, he remembered the fleeting moments of joy, the laughter, the warmth of connection. The shadows were only as powerful as he allowed them to be, and he wouldn't let them take him without a fight. With a surge of resolve, he took a step toward Emma, the shadows receding slightly, their grip loosening. I don't want to be afraid anymore, he whispered, his voice trembling. Then don't be, she urged, stepping closer. Face them. You're not alone in this. Michael took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. He turned to the shadows, no longer cowering in fear. I will not be your prisoner, he shouted, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of defiance ignite within him. The shadows writhed in response, a visceral reaction to his newfound strength. The whispers morphed into anguished cries, echoing through the room. But Michael stood firm, emboldened by Emma's presence. He was not alone. He would fight back against the darkness that had sought to consume him. In that moment, The shadows recoiled, retreating to the corners of the room, their voices fading into a distant murmur. Michael felt a rush of relief wash over him, but the battle was far from over. He knew the shadows would return, but for now, he had taken a stand. With Emma by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to confront the darkness within and reclaim his life from the clutches of fear. The fight had only just begun, but he was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the strength of their connection, a light piercing through the overwhelming shadows. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The nights grew longer, each one a descent into madness for Michael. He was caught in a ceaseless cycle of dread and disillusionment, unable to escape the grasp of the shadows that slithered through his mind. The initial promise of the cognitive enhancement drug had transformed into a waking nightmare, leaving him stranded on the precipice of his sanity. Each morning, he woke with the faintest glimmer of hope, only to find it crushed beneath the weight of reality. The sunlight that poured through his window felt cold and uninviting, the shadows stretching across the room like dark fingers reaching for him. He could no longer differentiate between what was real and what was a figment of his fractured mind. The whispers had morphed into a constant din, a cacophony that buzzed in his ears, blurring the lines of perception. "Help us! Help us!" The phrase had become a haunting refrain, echoing through the corridors of his thoughts, pulling him deeper into despair. He had tried to confide in Emma, to share the torment that threatened to consume him, but each time he opened his mouth, the words tangled in his throat. The fear of being dismissed, of being labeled as insane, held him captive. He spent hours wandering the streets, his mind a tumultuous sea of anxiety and paranoia. The world around him became a distorted reflection of itself. People moved like marionettes, their laughter and conversations blending into a nightmarish soundtrack that played on repeat. The colors of the city felt muted, the vibrancy of life dulled to a shade of gray. He was a ghost among the living, invisible yet suffocated by the weight of existence. As the days dragged on, he found himself retreating into the safety of his apartment, where the walls felt more familiar than the world outside. But even within the confines of his home, the shadows crept closer, curling around him like smoke. He had taken to sleeping with the lights on, yet it offered little solace. The darkness seeped into every crack, haunting him with visions of twisted figures and ghastly faces that danced just beyond the light's reach. On a particularly restless night, after tossing and turning for hours, Michael awoke to the sensation of being watched. He lay still, heart pounding, straining to hear any sound that might confirm his fears. The whispers had returned, now sharper and more insistent, weaving through the silence like a snake through grass. "Join us!" The voice slithered into his ears, wrapping around his thoughts, constricting like a vice. He shot up in bed, the sheets tangled around him, and glanced around the room, heart racing. Shadows pooled in the corners, shifting and writhing, coalescing into dark figures that seemed to leer at him from the depths of the darkness. "No! Get away from me!" he shouted, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. The figures remained, flickering in and out of existence, their outlines barely visible against the walls. They laughed, a high-pitched cackle that sent chills racing down his spine. The sound echoed in his mind, distorting into a sinister melody that filled him with dread. Panic surged within him, and he scrambled to his feet, bolting toward the door. He needed to escape, to break free from the suffocating grip of the shadows. But as he reached for the doorknob, the whispers grew louder, a swirling storm of voices crashing against his thoughts. "You can't escape." With a sudden burst of fear, he flung the door open and stumbled into the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Michael felt as though he were caught in a nightmare, the walls closing in, the darkness pushing him toward the brink of insanity. He raced down the corridor, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the whispers pursuing him like a malevolent force. The shadows in the hallway morphed into grotesque shapes, their edges sharp and menacing. He could feel their cold fingers clawing at his back, tugging him toward the abyss. "Help me!" he cried out, his voice echoing against the walls. But there was no response, only the insatiable laughter of the darkness behind him. Desperation propelled him forward as he reached the stairwell, the emergency lights casting an eerie glow. He bounded down the steps, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat of impending doom. As he reached the bottom, he burst through the exit door and stumbled into the night. Outside, the world felt surreal, painted in shades of grey under the dim streetlights. The cool air hit his face, refreshing, yet filled with an underlying tension. Michael leaned against a nearby lamppost, panting heavily, desperately trying to collect himself. But the whispers followed him, swirling around like a tempest, refusing to let him escape. Suddenly, he spotted a figure standing at the far end of the street, partially obscured by shadows. The figure was motionless, but even from a distance, Michael could sense its gaze boring into him, piercing through the night with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. He squinted, trying to discern any details, but the darkness concealed its features. The mere presence of the figure felt like a palpable threat, an embodiment of his fears. He took a hesitant step back, fear coiling in his gut. As if sensing his hesitation, the figure began to move, gliding toward him with an unnatural grace. Panic surged through Michael, and he turned to run, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he sprinted down the empty street, he could hear the whispers intensifying, echoing around him like a cacophony of despair. "You can't escape. Help us." He didn't know where he was running, only that he had to get away from the figure and the darkness that threatened to consume him. The world blurred around him, streetlights flickering like dying stars as he dashed through the labyrinth of the city, desperately searching for refuge. Finally, he stumbled into a small park, the trees looming like sentinels, their branches reaching out with twisted fingers. He collapsed onto a bench, breathless and shaking, trying to steady his racing heart. The whispers receded slightly, but the figure still loomed in the recesses of his mind, waiting for the right moment to strike. In that moment of vulnerability, Michael realized that the shadows were not just a manifestation of his fears. They were a reflection of his own mind, a twisted echo of the guilt and pain he had buried for so long. The shadows were relentless, but they were also a part of him, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness to claw their way back into his consciousness. As the cold night air wrapped around him, he felt a flicker of defiance ignite within. He could not let the darkness claim him. He would fight back against the shadows that haunted him. With every ounce of determination, he vowed to confront his fears and reclaim his life, even if it meant plunging deeper into the abyss to uncover the truth behind the whispers. The battle was far from over, and as he sat alone in the park, he understood that the shadows would continue to follow him, but he would not let them win. He was determined to face the darkness, to unravel the twisted echoes of his mind, and to emerge from the depths stronger than before. Chapter 6. An Unexpected Ally. The cold dawn light seeped through the grimy windows of Michael's apartment, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. He lay curled up on the floor, shivering despite the warmth of the blanket that lay discarded beside him. The night had been a torment, the whispers continuing to seep into his thoughts, pulling him deeper into the darkness. Each haunting echo was a reminder of his failures, his fears, and the shadows that had taken root in his mind. Michael forced himself to stand, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. The remnants of last night's panic attack lingered in his chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. He stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, hoping to wash away the nightmares that clung to him like a second skin. The reflection staring back at him was a hollow version of himself, eyes sunken, cheeks pale, haunted by the spectres of his own creation. As he stepped out of the bathroom, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, stretching toward him with malevolent intent. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of anxiety that had settled over him. He needed to get out of the apartment, to breathe fresh air, to remind himself that he was still alive and not merely a prisoner of his own mind. Gathering what little strength he had left, Michael made his way to a nearby cafe, hoping the bustle of morning life would distract him from the dark thoughts swirling in his head. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, a small sound that seemed to echo in the hollow spaces of his heart. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and for a brief moment, he felt a flicker of normalcy. He grabbed a cup of coffee and settled into a corner table, trying to immerse himself in the chatter around him. But the voices quickly faded into a murmur as the shadows began to creep in once more, invading his thoughts. The weight of his paranoia settled heavily on his shoulders, suffocating him as he gripped the mug tightly, feeling the heat seep through his fingers. Michael! The sound of his name cut through the fog, and he looked up to see Emma standing before him, her brow furrowed in concern. She had that familiar warmth in her eyes, a glimmer of hope that he desperately needed. "Hey," he managed, forcing a smile that felt like a mask. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I was worried about you," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "You've been acting so distant lately. I thought maybe we could talk." Michael hesitated, the shadows in his mind rising to meet his fears. He opened his mouth to protest, to push her away, but something in her gaze held him captive. The sincerity in her eyes felt like a lifeline thrown into the turbulent sea of his anxiety. "I don't know if I can," he began, but Emma's steady gaze cut through his hesitation. "Please, just let me in," she urged, her voice a soft anchor in the storm. "I can help you. You don't have to face this alone." The shadows that lingered in his thoughts shifted at her words, a flicker of light breaking through the oppressive darkness. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his chest ease slightly. "Okay," he said, the word tumbling out before he could think better of it. "But it's not pretty." As Michael shared the chaotic descent into his own mind, he felt the shadows retreat slightly, their grip loosening as he spoke the words aloud. He recounted the whispers, the figures lurking in the corners of his vision, and the crippling fear that threatened to engulf him. Emma listened intently, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "I believe you," she said firmly when he finished, her voice steady. "You're not going crazy, Michael. I think something is happening to you because of the drug trial. It's not just in your head, it's the drug's effect on you. We can find a way to understand it." "But what if it doesn't end?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I'm trapped in this nightmare forever?" Emma reached across the table, her hand brushing against his, grounding him. "We'll figure it out together. You don't have to fight this alone anymore." Her touch sent a shockwave through him, igniting a flicker of hope deep within his heart. For the first time in weeks, he felt a small spark of light amidst the shadows, a glimmer of possibility that perhaps he could find his way back to himself. As they sat in the cafe, Michael began to notice something unusual. The shadows around him shifted subtly, almost as if they were listening, lurking just out of sight. He glanced around the room, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw dark shapes flitting between the patrons, whispering, curling around the edges of reality. "Michael!" Emma's voice brought him back, and he realized he had been lost in his thoughts again. "Are you with me?" "Yeah, I'm here," he replied, shaking his head to clear the remnants of the vision. Sometimes I think I see things." "Things?" she prompted, concern etched across her features. "Shadows. Figures that seem to watch me," he admitted, feeling a sense of vulnerability wash over him. "They creep in when I least expect it." Emma's expression softened. "I know it sounds terrifying, but maybe we can face them together. Let's investigate the drug trial. We need to understand what's happening to you." The idea of digging deeper into the source of his torment both terrified and thrilled him. What if they found something that could help him reclaim his life? What if the truth was darker than he could imagine? "Okay," he said, nodding slowly. "Let's do it." After finishing their coffee, they made their way to the library, where Michael had spent countless hours buried in books before the trial began. As they entered, the familiar scent of old pages and wood polish wrapped around him like a comforting embrace. Yet, even here, he felt the shadows lurking at the periphery of his vision, whispering their malevolent secrets. They settled at a table strewn with books and papers, their surroundings swallowed by the looming darkness. Michael dove into research, poring over every piece of information he could find about the drug, the trial, and the unsettling reports of side effects from previous participants. Emma sat beside him, her presence a calming force as they unearthed the dark underbelly of the experiment. As they pieced together the information, a pattern emerged, a series of disturbing accounts from past participants who had experienced similar symptoms, individuals who had descended into madness after the trial. Panic gripped Michael's chest as he read their accounts. the eerie parallels drawing a clear line between their experiences and his own. And then, as they sifted through the final reports, something caught Michael's eye, an ominous warning buried deep within the text about a certain batch of the drug that had been linked to psychotic breaks and hallucinations. A shiver raced down his spine as he read the names of those affected. One stood out among the rest: David Reynolds. The name sparked a flicker of recognition, but Michael couldn't place where he had heard it before. "Do you think," Emma began, but her voice trailed off as she caught the look on Michael's face. He nodded slowly, fear creeping back in. This isn't just random. They knew what they were doing. As they continued their research, the shadows around them seemed to swell, their whispers becoming a frantic chorus, drowning out their thoughts. Michael felt the familiar panic clawing at his throat, but this time he didn't let it consume him. With Emma beside him, he felt a surge of strength, a determination to confront the darkness that threatened to engulf him. "Let's find out what happened to David Reynolds," he said, resolute. "We need to understand what we're up against." The shadows fluttered in response, as if the very air was charged with their presence, wrapping around them like a shroud. But this time, Michael faced them with Emma by his side, ready to push back against the darkness. The battle was far from over, but he could feel the flicker of hope igniting in the depths of his heart, a spark that would guide them through the encroaching night. Together, they would uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. Chapter 7. Unraveling the Truth. The library felt like a sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos that swirled in Michael's mind. But even in its hallowed halls, the shadows loomed. As he and Emma pored over stacks of documents and studies, the weight of the dark presence hung over them like a suffocating fog. The whispers grew louder with each passing hour, snaking through the pages and wrapping around his thoughts, taunting him with their insistent chorus. "Help us! Join us!" Michael clenched his fists, trying to push the voices aside, forcing his focus back onto the text in front of him. Emma was deep in concentration, her brow furrowed as she flipped through reports detailing the side effects of the drug. Hallucinations, paranoia, and psychotic breaks. Each account felt like a thread unraveling a larger tapestry of despair, drawing him further into a world that seemed determined to consume him. "Here," Emma said suddenly, her voice a mix of excitement and dread. She pointed to a highlighted section in one of the reports. This batch was linked to a number of adverse reactions, including those who experienced extreme hallucinations. And look, it says here that they lost contact with some of the participants. The words hung heavy in the air, a grim portent of the fate that could await them. "Lost contact? What do you mean?" "Just that they went missing after the trial," Emma replied, her voice trembling slightly. "No follow-ups, no communication. It's as if they just vanished." A chill crept down Michael's spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows lurking in the corners were listening, watching their every move. The figures that danced just beyond the periphery of his vision seemed to grow more distinct, more menacing. "What if we're not the first?" he murmured, dread pooling in his gut. "What if there's something more sinister at play here?" Emma's eyes widened, and for a moment, the unspoken horror of their situation hung between them. What if the drug was designed to do more than just enhance cognition? What if it's controlling us? Michael finished, his voice barely above a whisper. The implication sent a jolt of fear through him, resonating in the depths of his mind like a death knell. He remembered the figure from his nightmares, the presence that had haunted him with whispers of joining them. Was it possible that he had unwittingly stepped into a trap? With newfound urgency, they continued their search, digging deeper into the archives, sifting through papers that felt heavy with the weight of lost souls. Each document they uncovered felt like another layer peeled away from the darkness, revealing a hidden truth that sent shivers down Michael's spine. Hours passed as they combed through the records, the library growing dimmer with the encroaching night. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. As the last rays of daylight faded outside, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of Michael's stomach, the silence of the library growing oppressive. Then, without warning, the whispers surged again, echoing through the aisles like a mournful wail. "Join us! Help us!" Michael's breath hitched as he glanced toward the source of the sound, the shadows elongating and twisting in the dim light. "Emma," he said, voice shaking. "Do you hear that?" She looked up, her face pale. "I thought it was just in your head, but it's getting louder." The air felt electric, charged with an energy that prickled at his skin. "We need to get out of here," he urged, heart racing. But as they turned to leave, the shadows thickened, swirling around them like a dark tide, blocking their path. "Help us!" The voices crescendoed into a cacophony, a desperate plea that sent Michael's heart racing. The shadows began to coalesce, forming dark figures that loomed closer, their features obscured but unmistakably sinister. "Run!" Emma screamed, grabbing Michael's arm as they darted toward the exit. But the shadows surged forward, reaching for them with long, grasping fingers. They burst through the doors, the cool night air hitting them like a wave, but the whispers chased them into the darkness. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows that seemed to pulse in time with their racing hearts. "Where do we go?" Emma gasped, glancing around wildly. Michael's mind raced, scrambling for a plan. "The park! There's less light there. Maybe we can lose them in the shadows." They sprinted toward the park, the shadows retreating momentarily as they plunged into the embrace of the trees. But the whispers did not fade. They followed, echoing through the night, clawing at Michael's sanity. Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The streets felt alive as Michael and Emma stepped away from the park, yet the shadows lingered at the periphery of his vision, coiling around them like an insistent fog. Despite the victory they had just achieved, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was merely lying in wait, biding its time until he let his guard down. As they walked, the distant hum of city life surrounded them, but Michael felt isolated in a bubble of anxiety. Every flickering streetlight cast unsettling shadows that danced along the pavement, distorting reality and feeding his paranoia. The darkness felt palpable, creeping closer with every step they took, and he fought the urge to glance over his shoulder, terrified of what he might see. "Let's go to my place," Emma suggested, her voice cutting through the thick silence that enveloped them. "We can talk more about what we found. We need to figure out how to stop this once and for all." He nodded, grateful for her presence. Being with Emma grounded him, a lifeline in a world that had become increasingly chaotic and terrifying. But as they made their way to her apartment, the weight of their shadows pressed against him, whispering doubts that clawed at his sanity. "You can't escape." The journey to Emma's apartment felt longer than usual, each step weighted down by an unseen force. As they ascended the stairs to her third-floor unit, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of dust and the faint hint of something rotting just beneath the surface. It was an unsettling smell that seemed to cling to the walls, and Michael could feel his heart pounding in his chest as they reached her door. Emma unlocked the door and stepped inside, motioning for Michael to follow. The interior of her apartment was warm and inviting, filled with the soft glow of lamps that cast a golden light against the walls. Yet, even here, the shadows seemed to linger, lurking in the corners and shifting in the dim light. "Sit down," Emma said, gesturing to the couch. Michael sank onto the cushions, exhaustion washing over him like a tide. "We need to figure out what's going on with this drug and what we can do to protect ourselves." "I can't stop thinking about that name," Michael replied, running a hand through his hair. "David Reynolds. There's something about him that feels familiar." Emma retrieved a notebook from the coffee table and opened it to a page filled with notes and highlights. "I remember reading that name in the reports. He was one of the participants who experienced severe hallucinations and ultimately went missing. There's not much information about him, but I found a few online forums where people discussed their experiences with the drug." "Let's look at those," Michael urged, a flicker of determination igniting in his chest. Perhaps understanding what had happened to David would help them unravel the truth behind the shadows that haunted them. They spent the next hour diving into the dark corners of the internet, searching for any scrap of information they could find. Michael's fingers flew over the keyboard, scrolling through threads filled with desperate accounts from other trial participants, stories that mirrored his own haunting experiences. As they read, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, swirling around them like a living entity. Michael felt a sense of foreboding wash over him, as if the darkness were aware of their investigation, lurking just beyond the light. "Here," Emma said suddenly, pointing to a thread titled "Lost Souls of the Cognitive Enhancement Trial." The posts were filled with anguished cries for help, participants detailing their descent into madness, experiences that echoed Michael's own. "Look at this," she said, reading aloud. David Reynolds spoke about seeing shadowy figures in his home, feeling like he was being watched. He mentioned something about hearing voices, whispering to him. The words struck Michael like a bolt of lightning, the realization settling over him like a cold shroud. "That's exactly what I've been experiencing," he said, his voice trembling. "But how can we stop it? If it's connected to the drug?" Emma paused, her expression turning serious. "Maybe it's not just about stopping the drug. What if we need to confront the source of these shadows? What if David is still out there, trapped in this darkness?" The thought sent a chill down Michael's spine. "Trapped? You mean like a spirit? Or something worse?" "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if he's still suffering, we have to find him. We can't leave him in the shadows." A shiver ran through Michael at the thought of searching for someone lost in the darkness. But deep down, he understood that this was their path. They couldn't let the shadows consume them without a fight. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air, an ominous presence that threatened to engulf them. "Let's go back to the park," he said, determination flooding his veins. "If David's essence is tied to this place, we have to confront it. We have to bring him back." Emma nodded, her resolve mirroring his. "We'll do it together." As they stepped back into the night, the air felt charged with electricity. The journey back to the park felt different this time, more like a pilgrimage into the unknown. The darkness encroached upon them, whispering its promises of despair, but Michael pushed through the growing sense of dread. Arriving at the park, they found the shadows swirling more aggressively than before, thick and menacing. The moon hung high, casting an eerie light over the landscape, illuminating the grotesque shapes that flickered just beyond the light's reach. "Stay close," Emma urged, gripping Michael's hand tightly as they moved deeper into the heart of the park. The air grew colder, a palpable chill that sent shivers down Michael's spine. As they approached the clearing where they had confronted the darkness before, a wave of nausea washed over him. He could feel the whispers rising again, a torrent of voices that echoed in his mind. "Help us! Join us!" "David!" Michael called into the night, his voice trembling as it echoed through the clearing. "If you can hear us, we're here to help!" For a moment, silence enveloped them, the shadows hanging in the air like a thick fog. But then, a shape began to emerge from the darkness, a figure slowly materializing before them. Michael's heart raced as the figure stepped into the light, its features obscured but undeniably human. "Michael!" The voice was soft, a whisper carried on the wind. "David!" Michael felt his breath catch in his throat, a mixture of fear and hope flooding his senses. The figure stepped closer, revealing a gaunt face that bore the weight of suffering. Dark circles hung under David's eyes, and his expression was one of anguish, trapped in a perpetual state of despair. "Help me! I can't escape!" David's voice trembled, the words clawing at Michael's heart. The shadows around them began to writhe, their whispers growing louder, turning into a tumultuous storm of sound. Michael could feel the darkness pressing in, the oppressive weight threatening to crush them under its grip. "We're here to help you!" Emma shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos. "You're not alone, David. You can break free from this." The shadows recoiled momentarily, but David remained ensnared in their grasp. "I can't. They won't let me go." Michael stepped forward, determination igniting within him. "We'll fight the shadows together. You have to remember who you are. You're not just a prisoner of this darkness." As he spoke, the figure flickered, the shadows clawing at David's form, but Michael refused to let fear control him. He reached out, hand extended, willing David to break free from the chains that bound him. "Remember your strength," Michael urged, feeling the weight of his own fears fall away. "You are not defined by this darkness." With a shudder, David looked up, his eyes filled with a flicker of recognition. I remember." The The shadows recoiled as if repulsed by the light that flickered in David's eyes, the grip of despair loosening around him. "Together, we can banish the darkness!" Emma shouted, stepping closer, her voice filled with conviction. In that moment, the figure began to glow, a faint light radiating from within, pushing back against the encroaching shadows. The whispers turned to howls of anguish, a cacophony of desperation as the darkness writhed in fury. With a final surge of energy, Michael and Emma stood side by side, hands clasped tightly with David's. "We are stronger than the shadows!" they shouted in unison. The shadows screamed, an otherworldly wail that reverberated through the night, but their cries began to fade as the light surged brighter. The darkness writhed in protest, but the trio stood firm, united against the overwhelming tide. With one final cry, the shadows dissipated, retreating into the night as the light enveloped them, illuminating the clearing in a brilliance that felt almost divine. And in that moment, Michael felt the weight of the darkness lift from his shoulders, the whispers fading into silence. David stood beside them, his form solid and radiant, freed from the shackles of despair. "We did it," Emma whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Yes," Michael replied, his heart swelling with a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. "We faced the darkness together." As the night deepened around them, they stood united, their bond stronger than ever. The Shadows May, Chapter 9, Echoes of the Past. The dawn broke with a soft glow, casting light across the park where Michael, Emma, and David stood in the aftermath of their confrontation with the shadows. The oppressive darkness that had loomed over them had lifted, but the air still felt charged, thick with the remnants of the struggle they had endured. Michael took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. He glanced at David, whose face now held a semblance of peace, a stark contrast to the haunted expression he had worn moments before. The shadows that had once consumed him were gone, but Michael knew that the echoes of the past would linger, whispering reminders of the darkness they had all faced. "Are you all right?" Emma asked, her voice soft, yet tinged with concern as she studied David's features. David nodded slowly, the weariness in his eyes replaced by a flicker of hope. "I think so," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. I remember everything now. The trial, the drug, how it changed me." The memory flooded back, and the pain of his experience clawed at him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the present. "I was trapped in my own mind, lost in the darkness," he continued, shaking his head. "But you both pulled me back. I don't know how to thank you." "It's not over yet," Michael said, the weight of reality crashing back down. "We need to figure out what to do next. The shadows may be gone for now, but we can't let our guard down. They could return." As they spoke, the park began to awaken around them. Birds chirped in the trees, and the sun rose higher, casting away the remnants of night. Yet, beneath the surface, Michael could feel the tendrils of fear creeping back, whispering doubts that clawed at his mind. "Let's get out of here," Emma suggested, glancing around as if the shadows might still be lurking nearby. "We can talk more at my place. We need to regroup and figure out how to stop this for good." With a sense of urgency, they made their way back to Emma's apartment, the sun climbing higher in the sky, but Michael felt the darkness lurking just beneath the surface. He was determined to face it, to confront the truth of what had happened to him and the others who had been part of the trial. Once inside, they settled into the familiar warmth of Emma's living room, the sunlight streaming through the windows and casting long shadows on the floor. But even in this haven, Michael felt the echoes of the past resonate in the air. "Let's review everything we found," Emma said, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up the documents they had gathered the previous night. "We need to figure out how to prevent this from happening again, not just for us, but for anyone else who might be affected." As she scrolled through the reports, Michael felt a sense of unease settle over him. The memories of his descent into darkness began to flood back, the whispers returning like unwelcome guests. "Help us! Join us! Michael, are you with us?" Emma's voice pulled him from the abyss, and he shook his head, trying to clear the fog. "Yeah, sorry, just thinking," he replied, but the unease lingered, crawling along his spine like a serpent. David leaned forward, his expression serious. We need to understand what we're dealing with. The shadows are more than just a manifestation of our fears. They are tied to the drug. We have to confront the truth of the trial. Michael nodded, the weight of David's words settling heavily on his shoulders. We need to track down other participants from the trial. If we can find them, we might uncover more about the effects of the drug, and maybe even help those who are still suffering. As they strategized, the shadows in the room flickered ominously, twisting at the edges of their vision. Michael felt the air grow colder, the whispers rising again, wrapping around him like a shroud. Join us. He pushed back against the fear, focusing on the warmth of Emma's hand resting on his arm. We'll find them, he said, determination flooding his voice. We'll expose the truth. But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of doubt creeping in. What if the shadows returned? What if the darkness was never truly gone? With newfound resolve, they set out to uncover the truth. They began their search, reaching out to other participants from the trial, piecing together their stories and experiences. Each account felt like a thread woven into a larger tapestry of despair, revealing a chilling pattern of fear and suffering. The more they uncovered, the more Michael felt the shadows tightening around him, whispering their haunting refrain. The echoes of those lost in the darkness began to seep into his thoughts, threatening to drown him in despair. We need to be careful, Emma warned as they dug deeper into the investigation. The darkness feeds on fear. If we're not cautious, it could consume us again. Michael nodded, but a part of him was terrified. He felt as though they were standing on the edge of a precipice, peering into the abyss, and he wasn't sure if they would survive the fall. Chapter 10. Embracing the Light. As Michael stepped out of the community centre, the cool night air wrapped around him like a comforting embrace, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness that had loomed over his life for far too long. The street lamps flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced along the pavement. But tonight, those shadows felt less menacing. He could feel the echoes of the meeting resonating within him, a chorus of voices united in a common struggle against the darkness. Emma walked beside him, her presence a steady anchor in the turbulent waters of his mind. They had faced the abyss together, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he dared to hope. Hope was a fragile thing, a flicker of light in an expanse of darkness, but it was enough to guide him forward. Michael, Emma said, breaking the silence that enveloped them. What now? What do we do next? He paused, looking up at the night sky, where a scattering of stars twinkled faintly against the inky backdrop. I think we need to keep spreading the word, he replied, the determination in his voice strengthening with each passing moment. There are still people out there who need help. We can't let them suffer in silence. Emma nodded, her eyes shining with resolve. We'll start a support group. We can create a safe space for those affected by the trial, a community where they can share their experiences and find strength in one another. As they spoke, the whispers of the past faded into the background, but Michael could still feel the shadows lurking at the edges of his consciousness. He understood that this was not the end of their journey. It was merely a new beginning. The darkness would always be a part of him, but he had learned to confront it, to stand firm against its encroaching grip. When they reached Emma's apartment, the familiar warmth enveloped them, but a chill lingered in the air, a reminder that the shadows were never truly gone. The walls, adorned with photographs and mementos, felt like a sanctuary, but Michael couldn't shake the sense that something was still watching, lurking just beyond the light. Let's plan for tomorrow, Emma said, her voice steady despite the unease that hung between them. They settled on the couch, surrounded by the comforting glow of lamplight. But even here, Michael felt the shadows creeping closer, their presence a constant reminder of the battle they had fought. As they began to brainstorm ideas for the support group, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The shadows flickered, stretching toward them with an insatiable hunger. Michael glanced around, feeling a sense of unease settle in the pit of his stomach. Emma, do you feel that? He asked, his voice low, barely a whisper. Feel what? She replied, her brow furrowing in confusion. The shadows. It's like they're closing in, he said, anxiety creeping into his tone. I can sense them, as if they're waiting for the right moment to strike. Emma frowned, glancing around the room as if she could see the darkness that clung to the corners. We faced them at the park. We can do it again. As they continued their conversation, Michael felt a chill sweep through the room, the air growing dense and heavy. The shadows that had once felt like mere whispers now seemed to pulse with a life of their own, swirling and coiling as if drawn to their resolve. "Join us!" The familiar voice echoed through the room, the words wrapping around him like a vice. Michael's heart raced as he shot up from the couch, the darkness surging closer, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. "Get back!" he shouted, fear clawing at his throat. He could see the shadows coalescing into figures, their outlines becoming more defined, faces twisted in anguish, mouths moving in silent screams. "Michael!" Emma cried, but her voice was lost amidst the rising chaos. The figures surged forward, their whispers morphing into a cacophony of despair. "Help us! Help us!" Michael felt his resolve waver, panic flooding his senses as the shadows reached for him. Memories of his past, the failures, the regrets, flashed before his eyes, and he could feel the weight of guilt pressing down on him. The darkness threatened to overwhelm him, to pull him back into the abyss from which he had only just escaped. "No!" he shouted, clenching his fists, the warmth of Emma's presence grounding him. "You don't control me anymore." With a surge of determination, he reached out toward the shadows, drawing on the strength of the connections he had formed. The memories of laughter, friendship, and love flooded his mind, filling him with light that pushed against the darkness. "Leave us!" he cried, his voice strong and unwavering. "You will not take us again." The shadows recoiled at his words, the figures writhing and twisting as if in pain. The whispers turned to wails, a desperate chorus that echoed through the room. But Michael stood firm, unwilling to yield to the darkness. "Together!" Emma shouted, her voice a rallying cry. "We can face this! We have faced this!" With a deep breath, Michael focused on the light that ignited within him, the warmth of hope and connection that spread through his chest. He could feel the shadows begin to waver, their forms flickering as the light pushed against them. "Join us!" The figure at the forefront hissed, its voice a blend of temptation and malice. "You cannot escape your fate." "I can, and I will," Michael retorted, drawing on every ounce of strength he had. He felt the warmth of Emma's hand clasping his tightly, her resolve bolstering his own. "We are not your prisoners." The shadows surged forward, but Michael and Emma stood united, their hands clasped together as a beacon of light ignited between them. The glow pushed against the encroaching darkness, illuminating the figures that had once felt so overpowering. The darkness screamed, an anguished wail that echoed through the apartment as the light engulfed them. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving in the face of their combined strength. With one final push, Michael thrust the light forward, the energy radiating outward like a shockwave. The shadows recoiled, dissipating into the night, their voices fading into silence. The room fell still, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the last remnants of darkness vanished. Michael and Emma stood together, breathless and shaken, but victorious. "We did it," Emma whispered, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, we did," Michael replied, feeling a mixture of triumph and exhaustion wash over him. The shadows had been banished, at least for now, but he knew they would always be a part of him, a reminder of the battle he had fought and the strength he had found within. As they sank back onto the couch, the light in the room felt warmer, the air clearer. Michael looked at Emma, gratitude flooding his heart. "I couldn't have done this without you. You kept me grounded when I felt like I was losing myself." Emma smiled, a soft glow of hope lighting her features. "And you showed me the strength of your spirit. We're in this together, Michael. We always will be." The echoes of the past still whispered in the corners of his mind, but Michael felt lighter now. The darkness would return, he knew that much, but he also understood that he had the power to face it. He had allies, friends who would stand by him in the darkest of times. As the first light of dawn broke through the window, painting the room in soft hues of pink and gold, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The shadows may always linger, but he was ready to embrace the light, to fight for his freedom against the darkness that threatened to consume him. The journey was far from over, but with each step forward, he felt a flicker of hope ignite within him, a promise of resilience and a determination to reclaim his life. The battle against the shadows would continue, but now, armed with courage and connection, Michael was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Together, they would shine a light into the darkness, banishing fear and despair, forging a path toward healing and redemption.